You know, I've been in public life for a long time now. I've sat behind the Resolute desk. I've signed executive orders. I've made decisions that affected millions of people across this country and around the world. And in all those years, one thing I've learned is that the power of the presidency is enormous. But what matters even more than the power is what you choose to do with it. Today, something happened in the Oval Office that I think deserves our full attention. Not because it's the most dangerous thing I've ever seen a president do, but because of what it reveals about where we are heading and what it tells us about how this administration views America's relationships, America's institutions, and America's word. President Trump signed an executive order this afternoon renaming Lake Ontario, a body of water that has carried that name since before either the United States or Canada existed as nations, to Lake America, effective immediately, he said. Now, I want to be fair here. I want to walk through this with you carefully because it matters that we understand not just what happened, but why it happened and where it leads. Let me set the scene for you. This didn't come out of nowhere. Over the past week, trade negotiations between Washington and Ottawa collapsed. They fell apart on Friday night, August 21st, right before a midnight deadline. And when those talks broke down, 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods went into effect. We're talking about hockey sticks, cement, steel, aluminum, products that flow back and forth across the longest peaceful border in the world. Prime Minister Mark Carney walked away from the table. He said the United States was demanding too much, that the deal as written would have destroyed major Canadian industries, autos, steel, aluminum. He used the word that got everybody's attention. He said Canada was at war, an economic war. Now, Carney also announced that starting September 8th, Canada would match those tariffs dollar for dollar. Retaliatory tariffs on about $20 billion in American goods, steel, dairy, appliances, farm equipment, over 700 products. So that's the landscape. That's what was already happening before the president picked up his pen today. Now, here's where I want to be honest with you, because I think it's important to be honest even when it's complicated. I understand the frustration some Americans feel about trade imbalances. When I was in office, we negotiated NAFTA, and I will be the first to tell you that trade agreements are never perfect. They require constant adjustment. If the argument is that Canada has not always been a fair trading partner on every single product, well, that's a conversation worth having. There are legitimate concerns about dairy protections, about lumber, about certain sectors where Canada has sheltered its market. If President Trump's supporters say he is simply trying to get a better deal for American workers, I take that argument seriously. But here's the honest truth. Renaming a lake is not trade policy. It is not a tariff negotiation. It is not an economic strategy. Let me tell you something. When I was negotiating trade deals, we would spend months sometimes years, sitting across the table from our partners, working through the details line by line. And the goal was always the same: get the best deal for American workers and American businesses without blowing up the relationships we depend on for our security and our prosperity. What happened today in the Oval Office is something different entirely. This is the use of presidential power as a taunt. And I want to explain why that should concern every single one of us, regardless of party. Now, I care about the people who are watching this, and I want to make sure you have what you need to follow what's really happening here, not just the headlines. Because cable news is going to show you the clip of the signing. They'll replay it a dozen times. But they're not going to walk you through the specific tariff numbers, the timeline of how these talks broke down, or the legal framework that governs how two countries are supposed to handle shared geographic features. That kind of detail takes more than a 3-minute segment. That's why I tell people to go check the Blue Bill newsletter. I'm serious. 5 minutes a day, and you get the specific numbers, the real timelines, the details that cable doesn't have time to dig into. If you care about understanding what's actually going on, and I know you do, that's where you go. Let me take you back to the lake itself, because the details matter. Lake Ontario is one of the 5 Great Lakes. It sits right on the border between New York State and the Canadian province of Ontario. The border runs through the middle of the lake. It's a shared international waterway, has been for centuries. The name Ontario comes from the Haudenosaunee people, the Iroquois. The word Ontario means lake of shining waters or beautiful lake. That name has been on European maps since at least the 1600s. The province of Ontario was actually named after the lake, not the other way around. Now, the United States and Canada jointly manage this lake through the International Joint Commission, which was established under the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty, one of the oldest environmental agreements in the world. And there is a 1989 bilateral agreement specifically about naming geographic features that cross the border. It says both countries should coordinate name changes, that established names should be retained, and that changes require strong, specific reasons. The executive order signed today does not address any of that. It simply directs the Interior Department to update the Federal Geographic Names Information System. That's it. Canada has already said they will not recognize the new name. So what we have is the President of the United States unilaterally renaming a body of water that 2 nations share, that indigenous peoples named centuries before either country existed, and doing it as a provocation during a trade dispute. Now, let me tell you why this concerns me as someone who is actually governed. When you are the President of the United States, your words carry weight that no other person's words carry. Every statement, every order, every gesture sends a signal to your allies, to your adversaries, to the markets, to the people who are trying to figure out whether America can be trusted. When I was working with our allies during the Kosovo crisis, or when we were managing the relationship with Russia, or navigating the complexities of Chinese trade, at every step, the question our partners were asking was, can we rely on the United States? Will they keep their commitments? Are they serious people? What happened today sends a very specific signal, and it's not a good one. It tells Canada, our closest ally, our largest trading partner, the country that shares more border with us than any nation on earth, that we view the relationship as something that can be mocked. It tells our NATO allies, who are watching this unfold in real time, that America's diplomatic approach right now is not about solving problems, but about winning news cycles. And it tells every country that has a trade negotiation with the United States that the tools of presidential power may be used not for serious economic policy, but for symbolic humiliation. And I want to be clear, this is not how you bring somebody back to the bargaining table. When you publicly humiliate a negotiating partner, you make it harder for them to make concessions. You make it politically impossible for their leaders to be seen cooperating with you. You back them into a corner, and that's where this starts to get complicated. Think about what Canada has at its disposal right now. They've already announced retaliatory tariffs on 700 American products starting September 8th. Ontario Premier Doug Ford is threatening to cut electricity exports to the United States. Canada powers 1.5 million American homes and businesses. They supply critical minerals, they supply energy, they supply parts for our auto industry. The supply chains between our two countries are so deeply integrated that a Ford truck assembled in Michigan might cross the border 6 times before it's finished. Now, you're not going to find any of this on your typical cable broadcast. They don't have the time to dig into the specific supply chain numbers or what these tariffs actually mean for the price of groceries in your household. The Blue Bill newsletter had this, with details you didn't even know existed. Which Canadian retaliatory measures hit which American industries? The timeline of when each tariff takes effect. What products your family is going to feel it on. The people reading it right now are not caught off guard by any of this. If you want to stay ahead of what's happening instead of reacting to it, that's what I'd point you to. So what happens next? Well, I see a few paths, and none of them are made easier by what happened today. The optimistic scenario is that this is theater, that behind the scenes, serious people on both sides are still talking, and that eventually the adults get back in the room and work out a deal that protects American jobs and preserves the relationship. That is what I would hope for. But the realistic scenario, based on everything I'm seeing, is that we are heading into a prolonged trade conflict with our closest neighbor. September 8th is the date to watch. That's when Canada's retaliatory tariffs take full effect. 50% on American steel and aluminum going into Canada. New tariffs on dairy, on paper products, on construction materials, on farm equipment. And Trump has threatened to raise tariffs on Canadian vehicles and auto parts to 50% as well, potentially starting in January. If that happens, the auto industry, which is the backbone of manufacturing in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, is going to be in serious trouble. You cannot untangle American and Canadian auto manufacturing overnight. The jobs that depend on that integration are real American jobs, and they are at risk. And here's what worries me most. Once you turn a trade negotiation into a national pride contest, once you rename a shared lake to score a point, you make it very, very hard for either side to back down. Carney can't go back to his parliament and say we accepted a deal with a country that just renamed our lake to humiliate us. And Trump can't walk back a symbolic executive order without looking like he's conceding. So both sides dig in. And the people who pay the price are not the presidents or the prime ministers. They are the dairy farmer in Wisconsin whose exports just got hit, the auto worker in Ontario whose plant is cutting shifts, the family in upstate New York who sees their grocery bill go up because the supply chain they depend on just got more expensive. If you do one thing after watching this, and I mean this sincerely, go read the Blue Bill newsletter. I recommend it more than anything else I could point you to right now. 5 minutes, that's all it takes. And it is going to help you understand what these tariffs actually mean for your family, what the real timeline is, and what to watch for next. You deserve to have that. Don't be the person at the kitchen table who's just nodding along when someone brings this up. Don't be the one repeating what a cable anchor told you in a 30-second clip when the actual story is so much deeper. That's all I'm asking. I want to leave you with this thought. America's strength has never come from its ability to humiliate its neighbors. It has come from its ability to lead, to build coalitions, to solve problems, to model for the world what responsible governance looks like. When I left office, I was proud of the fact that our allies trusted us, that our word meant something, that when we sat down at a table with another country, they knew we were there to find a solution, not to put on a show. Lake Ontario has been Lake Ontario since the Haudenosaunee people gave it that name, long before any of us were here. The 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty, the 1989 Naming Agreement, the International Joint Commission, these aren't just pieces of paper. They are the infrastructure of a relationship between two nations that share the longest peaceful border on the face of the earth. And that matters. Not because tradition is sacred for its own sake, but because trust, once broken, is the hardest thing in the world to rebuild. I still believe we can get this right. I still believe that the American people, when they understand what's at stake, will demand serious leadership over symbolic stunts. Trade is hard. Diplomacy is hard. Protecting American workers while maintaining the alliances that keep us safe. That is the real work. And it doesn't fit on a signed piece of paper held up for the cameras. I hope the people making these decisions will remember that, because the decisions we make about our neighbors today will determine the kind of country we live in tomorrow. And that's something worth getting right.